All right, and we are recording.
Excellent. All right, so welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the third installment of Family Support Center's Sexual Assault Awareness Month webinar series. My name is Grace, and today we are looking at supporting University of Wisconsin Eau Claire student survivors, looking at the relationship between Family Support Center, CASA, and how it exists within the university system. Oh. Well, that's an interesting, there we go. Okay, so as I said, my name is Grace. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a sexual assault advocate with Family Support Center, housed on campus at UW Eau Claire as the CASA advocate. So to explain that a little bit, what this means is Family Support Center has a number of offices. So we have offices in downtown Eau Claire, downtown Chippewa Falls, and on campus here at UW Eau Claire. So we serve individuals, families, and communities affected by intimate partner violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, and other forms of interpersonal violence. My slides really are not advancing the way that okay. So a handful, just in a nutshell, this is what our services at Family Support Center at CASA look like. Again, they are available both in Eau Claire and Chippewa counties, and all of our services are free, completely free, and completely confidential. And that includes our 24-hour crisis and support line. This is a really great resource for folks, particularly university students who may need to utilize that at any time of day or night, any day of the year. We provide advocacy-based counseling and peer support, medical information, support, and accompaniment. So we can meet folks at the hospital, accompany them through a SAAM exam, et cetera, et cetera. We are not lawyers, but we can provide some legal information, support, and accompaniment to different court cases. We have boatloads of knowledge, tools, resources, and knowledge of places to refer folks. So if all of their needs can't be met within our agency, we can help them find agencies and organizations in the area that can help provide other services and supports. Additionally, we provide support and educational groups. This is where a lot of my background lies. And lastly, community outreach, education, and engagement, which is what we're here today doing. Before we jump in, I will point out that, so it is April 15th. We are right at that halfway mark of Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So we are here halfway through. Next week on Thursday, an advocate, excuse me, Kenzie, will be providing information on sex trafficking, stigmas, and sex work. And Amanda, the following week on Thursday, will be looking at Acknowledge and Interrupt, an LGBTQ plus related webinar. Okay, so just for today, a little bit of information on what to expect. We're going to look at sexual assault on college campuses, important legislation and major events, and then really take a look at CASA, take a look at the benefits of what this is a completely confidential resource on college campuses, what advocates do, how we can help, and the processes and options for reporting on campus. So before we jump into any of those things, it's probably important that we have a pretty good understanding of what sexual assault is. And then on the flip side of that, what consent is. So sexual assault is any act that breaks a person's trust or violates their sense of safety and is sexual in nature. So this includes forced, coerced or manipulated sexual activity, as well as sexual contact with someone who is unable to consent. So in this slide, you'll see this pyramid shape, not necessarily to show like the most serious of instances of sexual assault at the top and less serious on the bottom, but more to show and to illustrate that without these layers of foundational stuff, like without the social norm of entitlement, we probably wouldn't see that individual belief system that justifies aggression. So these build upon one another. And that's why I use this pyramid image. Whereas this next this next image shows more in a non-linear way that sexual violence is a continuum, but not necessarily from like least harmful to most harmful, which is challenging for some folks to wrap their heads around or to grasp, just because our culture and our society tells us that there is a clear distinction between one and the next. So things that I really like to point out in this are sharing nude photos without permission. It's not something generally that many people would recognize as sexual violence, certainly not 5 years ago, but we're seeing more and more. A lot of my background is in working with high school students, and something that high school students were shocked to know was sexual violence is catcalling or street harassment. The interesting thing is that these aren't just individual people and their behaviors that can be considered as sexual violence, but also sexist media and advertising. There are things that contribute to these issues and these instances of sexual violence as well. On the flip side of that, I think it's super important to spend some time talking about what consent is. Again, much of my background is working with high school students or middle school students. And when you first ask what consent is, a lot of the time what you hear is that it's permission. And while that is very important, there are lots of pieces of consent that are really important that I think are oftentimes left out of this conversation. Things that are scattered across this slide. So are people feeling empowered, right? Are they active in the process? Are there boundaries that they feel safe to communicate? On the bottom right-hand corner is consent is fries. This is something that I see not only within our organization, but also in other areas and other spaces. I've seen it in classrooms. I've seen it on bulletin boards. And essentially what this says, it's this helpful little acronym that says that consent is freely given, and that speaks to the uncoerced, unforced, unmanipulated, right? Reversible, which means that everyone has the right to change their minds. Informed, that they know what they're signing up for, right? Enthusiastic. This is, consent should be the lowest bar. We should be looking for enthusiastic partners. We should be looking for participation, right? And lastly is specific. So just because someone consents to one activity does not mean they are consenting to X, Y, and Z as well. And so I think that sometimes when we talk about consent, it can feel like, oh, there's all these new pieces. What is active? What is process? How does power play a role, right? But really, consent is not something that's difficult to understand. This bottom left image says consent is an enthusiastic yes. And we've definitely seen a shift from this no means no narrative into more of yes means yes, which I think is really interesting to see that shift, and have worked with folks in this kind of educational way through that shift has been really interesting. So speaking to sexual assault and speaking to consent. At this point, I just want to pause briefly, make sure everyone's on the same page. Any questions about sexual assault, any questions about consent or our agencies? Okay. Feel free to use the chat. My colleagues will be keeping an eye on it for me, and feel free to interrupt me at any time with questions as well. Moving onward then. So briefly, I want to take a look at statistics of sexual assault on college campuses. But before I speak to it at all, I want to really point out that statistics can be tricky. Sexual violence is notoriously difficult to measure, and there is not a single source of data that provides a complete picture of these instances. And that's for a lot of reasons. Another thing to think about as I go through these statistics is that oftentimes I find that folks can depersonalize the issue when it's provided or when it's presented to us in numbers. So keeping in mind as I go through these next two slides that each of these numbers represents people and their lives, and lives that have perhaps been altered in significant ways because of these issues. So what we see, keep both copies here in front of me, is that women between the ages of 18 and 24 are at highest risk of experiencing sexual violence. All of these statistics come from RAIN, if you're interested in learning more. That college women are twice as likely to be sexually assaulted than robbed, and that sexual assaults happen on college campuses more than any other crime. And really importantly, on the right side of the screen here is reasons victims cite for not reporting. And there are all kinds of reasons, and each and every one of these reasons is valid. And I think that that's important to point out as we talk about statistics, because it's hard to get statistics that are truly representative when people don't feel safe reporting. So continuing on with these same thoughts, and these all came also from RAIN, is 1 in 5 women and 1 in 16 men are sexually assaulted while in their college years. 1 in 5 and 1 in 16. And these are really significant numbers. And I think that within power-based or gender-based violence, we always see really significant numbers. And I think the fact of the matter is that no one involved in this field has ever come across a statistic that they are comfortable with, which is why we do the work that we do, many of us. 13% of students experience rape or sexual assault through physical force, violence, or incapacitation. So I think this is important to point out too, that a lot of times general society, when they are faced with the term sexual assault or rape, there's a story that is connected, right? And that story is typically one that comes to us from media. And the story or narrative that we typically get from media, especially I think with like college, well, maybe not necessarily specifically with college age students, but is that it's a stranger, someone jumped out of the bushes, right? And it was like violent or they were held down, right? And 13% is significant enough that it makes me ill. But I think it's important to point out that that is definitely the minority of these experiences, because what we see as we go down these bullet points, the last one is that 90% of campus sexual assaults are committed by perpetrators the victim already knows. And if that person is someone the victim already knows, we may not see that physical force, violence, or incapacitation, although we certainly do. These acquaintance rapes or sexual assaults have a little bit different components, if you will. So going back up now, more than 50% of college sexual assaults occur in either August, September, October, or November. So what we know is that many students experience these things the beginning of their college experience or the beginning of their semesters. And as if experiencing a sexual assault at any time isn't difficult enough, co-occurring sexual assaults with your first day of college can cause some significant issues. And we're going to talk about that as I continue. And lastly, 63.3% of men at one university self-reported acts qualifying as rape or attempted rape admitted to committing repeated rapes. So let me break this down a little. There was some research that was conducted, or a survey that was given at a university. I'll be honest, I don't remember which university, but you can find this online. And they didn't use the language of rape. What they did was use some of, like, let's say, language implying coercion, or language implying manipulation. And 63.3% of men at that university said, yeah, I guess I have done that. Again, they didn't opt in and say, yes, I have raped people, but just the language that describes those things. And what they also found was that those people were also more likely to commit those things more than once. It's also important to recognize that there are certain populations on campus that may be more susceptible to committing harm. By no means am I saying that all college athletes or all folks who are involved with Greek life on campus universities, are they sexual predators, or are they predisposed to be making these decisions that ultimately lead to sexual assault? But what they are is typically an environment or a culture that contributes to these issues. So what are colleges and universities required to do about all of these wild statistics, all these wild numbers? So we know it exists. We know that it's bad. We know that it's impacting a lot of people. What are colleges and universities required to do? So the first civil rights law we're going to look at is called Title IX. This is something that many people are familiar with in the context of sports and equal opportunity between genders. So that's typically people's first experience with Title IX. And it's a lot deeper than that. So Title IX is a federal civil rights law passed as part of the Education Amendments of 1972. And this law protects people from discrimination based on sex in education programs or activities that receive federal financial assistance, which is basically all public schools. And it specifically says in quotations here at the bottom, no person, you've probably heard this before, no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any educational program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So this, beyond just ensuring that the girls' basketball team has the same funding as the boys' basketball team, it also protects us against sexual harassment, sexual assault, dating and domestic violence, stalking, gender discrimination, retaliation, and sexual exploitation while we are enrolled. The second major piece of this is the Clery Act. And the Clery Act requires colleges and universities to do the following in regards to sexual assault reports. So universities are required to publish an annual security report. They're required to disclose crime statistics for incidents that occur on campus or in unobstructed public areas, like really close to campus, basically. Which would spill into Water Street for Eau Claire. They are required to issue timely warnings about the Clery Act crime, which pose a serious or ongoing threat to students or employees. So if there is a threat to crime, like let's say there is a sexual assault that happens on campus and the harm doer, perpetrator, gets away, is not found, is not identified, something like this, the university is required to put out a notice to students. So this is all part of that Clery Act. And lastly, they are required to devise an emergency response, notification and testing policy. And this has unrolled at the University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire, and I think many campuses as a text service, as a, in addition to like the loudspeakers or announcements that are kind of blasted through campus that way. And I think it's important to point out that the Clery Act is named after Jean Cleary, who was raped and murdered in her dorm room in 1986. The harm doer was another student, and her parents believe oh, yes. Okay. And so her parents believe that had they had this information, they would have been better informed, which again, being better informed doesn't necessarily protect us from these things. The only thing that can stop these instances of harm from happening are harm doers. But it is important for folks to be aware. I'm going to pause very briefly and just check in. Any questions, any comments, anything that stands out to folks?
I just want to say it's really interesting to me that the Clery Act was created through what sounds like was some victim blame me language, that they felt that by she could have been more cautious and could have avoided an assault from happening if the school had been making folks aware of other crimes that were committed on campus. So it's just interesting to see that, like, I think the Clery Act is very beneficial and has a lot of really great additions to campus security, but it was built off of this belief that she should have been able to save herself, kind of a thing. And I didn't know that until now. That's really interesting.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Kenzie, because I think that it is important to recognize that we know that these things happen on every college campus and university in our country, right? And I would go as far as saying that they, in 1986, probably knew these things were happening on college campuses as well. So the idea that the Cleary family had no idea that these things were happening or would have happened is a difficult one to accept. And also recognizing that reporting crimes that happen on campus is very important, but it won't necessarily stop them from continuing, which is where a bunch of other stuff comes in, because no two laws or rules can fix an issue that is this pervasive. Any other thoughts before I move forward?
Yeah, I also wanted to comment. I think about the fears that universities might have about campus sexual assaults being reported and people viewing these numbers and being understandably alarmed by them, which is not to say that's not an appropriate reaction. But if we kind of reframe that as advocates, like Grace noted, these acts of violence are happening regardless. And the fact that there's a process equipping students with the ability to report, and there are resources like CASA on campuses that are positioned to work with students to ensure that they aren't just reporting into the void, that they have some support for healing. I think that just speaks to the, evolution of how, we're starting to view sexual assault in our society. So maybe it signals some positives that more reports are coming through, because there are these systems in place now to be able to handle those and to give survivors what they need to maybe, heal from the violence.
Yeah, that occurred on a campus, right? So as a part of it too becomes a responsibility. So thank you very much, Kenzie and Amanda.
I also have a thought here. It's almost like I feel the need to give almost a PSA to juniors and seniors in high school and being like, hey, this is information you should have, and this is where you can go before you even get there. And talking about, their awareness of wherever they're applying to and like what that crime statistic looks like wherever they're interested in, and if that's going to make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I am a firm believer that no one should graduate high school without a very clear understanding of what consent is and what consent isn't. And yeah, taking that even a step further, can you imagine how interesting that would be for students to dig into that research, to check and compare from university to university, and analyze that, right? Because just because a university says we only had 5 instances of sexual assault on our campus this year, we know that that's not true. Like we know that that's not true. Those might have been the 5 cases that were reported, but those are not necessarily accurate depictions of things that are happening. And again, I want to point out that sometimes when it comes to schools, universities, and things like that, they can be weary and wary of reporting these numbers. And again, I just want to share that this is not a Eau Claire problem. This is not a Dartmouth problem. This is not a Stanford problem, right? This is a cultural issue that reaches every campus in our country, large or small. Now I'm getting ahead of myself. So let me go through this brief timeline of major events. Full disclosure, this is not an exhaustive list, but just a few things that kind of get our heads wrapped around the progression of understanding these issues. So in 1957 was one of the first published studies about campus sexual assault. And it was titled Sex Aggression on a University Campus. And it appears in the American Sociological Review. In 1972, Title IX is put into place, right? We just talked about Title IX that prohibits sex-based discrimination in any school. A few years after that, 1975, the term date rape is coined by Susan Brown Miller. A decade later, Miss Magazine and Mary R. Koss survey more than 6,100 undergraduate women and men for one of the largest scientific studies of date rape at the time. 4 years later, Kimberly Crenshaw, a civil rights activist and legal scholar, coined the term intersectionality, which refers to the multitude of different identities that people carry and people hold, and the number, or I guess the way that it impacts their experiences, positive or negative. 1992, what a great year. That was the year I was born. The Campus Sexual Assault Victims Bill of Rights, which essentially, all of that language, is the Clery Act. That was passed in Congress in 1992. In 2011, and 2015, Dear Colleague letters were sent out to all academic institutions that receive federal money. And the Dear Colleague letters are a gentle reminder that schools and universities have an obligation to Title IX. And this was sent again to universities in 2015, reminding them that they needed, well, that schools need to assign a Title IX coordinator. Not just say that you are working on Title IX, but specifically have someone whose role is looking at Title IX and making sure that complaints are filed and followed through. 2013, President Obama signs the Campus Sexual Violence Elimination Act, SAVE, into law, which amended the Clery Act as part of the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA, reauthorization. And the three things that this one really focused on were transparency, so kind of like the Clery Act, right? Making sure that we're sharing that information. Accountability, making sure that they're following up with it and doing something, and education and prevention. In 2014, the White House Task Force to Protect Students from Sexual Assault released its first report called Not Alone. The report defines the problem of campus sexual assault and offers the White House first set of action steps and recommendations. So we've come a long way from, 1957, where we're just beginning to look at sex aggression on university campuses, to the point in 2014 where the White House is giving institutions steps. Here's how we begin, right? That's a big jump. One of the last I have on here is the Me Too movement. And this resurfaced in 2017. But I think it's most important to point out that a Black woman named Tarana Burke began this movement in 2006. And it was built to support victims and survivors of gender-based violence, especially in the Black community, especially Black girls and women. But I think it's really important to bring this up in our major events timeline, because it really began to shift the way that people see sexual assault, that people talk about sexual assault, and the stigmas attached to it. And finally, now and moving forward, the Campus Accountability and Safety Act, which was first introduced in 2014, is continually being debated. And this is something that would require confidential advisors who would serve as a confidential resource to students who are victims or survivors of crime, which is so wonderful, because what that is an advocate who's on campus, which is what I am at CASA for University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire. So in that way, it's great to see that we, in some ways, are a step ahead of the game. There are plenty of colleges and universities that don't have sexual assault survivor services housed on campus, but it is absolutely crucial. And ongoing, also Title IX language, policies, rules, they continue to roll out annually, essentially, for better or worse. Yes. So in comes CASA, right? So in come these confidential advisors, right? And CASA was established on campus at UW Eau Claire in 2003. And is victim-centered, which essentially means that victims and survivors drive the ship. They get to decide how an advocate can help them, what they share, when they share, etc. And I think really importantly, having CASA or having a space like CASA on a college campus can do 5 things. It can empower victims and survivors to reach out for help just by having it located here, right? It can provide a crucial step toward healing, pave the way for other survivors and victims to speak up, it can actually stop further sexual violence. So just by having a physical location specifically designed to support victims and survivors of sexual violence or power-based violence has an impact, right? It communicates something to the community. And lastly, it can reduce stigma just by normalizing that space. So CASA has a unique standing within the university system. We are one of those confidential advisors, right, which we just call ourselves advocates to victims and survivors, but also to staff and employees on campus, and the Eau Claire community at large. Again, all of our services are free and confidential. I am not a mandated reporter. So essentially what this looks like in practice is, as the CASA sexual assault advocate, I am affiliated with the university. So I am not a university employee, and I am not really connected in any way besides that's what my parking pass says and where my office is. And of course, the relationships that I've built while being on campus. Humans cannot learn and excel when they are activated by trauma or are constantly being triggered. Unprocessed trauma can disrupt daily life, including but not limited to academic achievements, our ability to work, our ability to get out of bed, right? Even engage in social activities, which in other words is college life, right? So it's extremely important that these supports are available. Oh yeah, so let's say there's a student who has experienced a sexual assault, and they're like, well, I don't even know where to go with this information. I'm lost, I'm confused, I never thought this would happen. And then as they begin thinking of supportive people in their life, maybe they think of their roommate, right? Or maybe they think of a professor they have a great relationship with. Perhaps there is an RA, right? Your RA or your hall director that you are close with because you've lived in the same hall for 3 years, 2 years, right? And this just kind of is an extra layer of why CASA is so important, is that sure, we want everyone on campus to be knowledgeable about these issues and be able to support victims and survivors. But what we also recognize as one of the most important pieces of that is that CASA is one of 3 confidential places that survivors can go on campus to receive support. And that includes, so CASA, student counseling services, and student health and wellness. Again, this might look familiar. It was previously in the training for today, so I won't spend too much time on it, but the same services that are provided with Family Support Center in Chippewa Falls are services that we support or that we provide here on campus. In addition to these, we also work with the dean's office really closely to ensure that the university is supporting victims and survivors any way that they possibly can as well, which means potentially having a student move out of one dorm room to another or to a different dorm building completely. Perhaps looking at their schedules, changing their class schedules, so that there are unique needs that students have that maybe a general community member might not need. Some things that we commonly see at CASA are folks who come through our doors who have experienced alcohol-facilitated sexual assault, acquaintance assault, again, so that's someone that you know. We looked at that numbers in the statistics that the vast majority are people that victims or survivors do know. Perhaps it's their partner, right? Coercion is something that we often see and a history of dating violence. So these are very common, but we also see folks who come to us who've experienced childhood sexual assault and other forms of intimate partner violence as well. Some common student responses when they are receiving services or after they have experienced sexual assault is guilt, shame, and self-blame. These are things that often are internalized because of our culture. We believe that perhaps we could have done things differently to prevent this from happening. There's also an extreme lack of comprehensive sexual health knowledge, and this goes double for LGBTQ+ students. It is alarming, I think, how few young adults have had real quality conversations about sexual health and intimacy, which is something that with my prevention background is something I'm very passionate about, something about getting that information into schools, getting that information to be something that adults are comfortable with. We'll get there. A reluctance to report or get help. So this is very common, I think, not just for college students, but there are a lot of barriers that can stop someone from reaching out or getting help. And that can be their relationship with their parents. Perhaps they were drinking at the time and they don't want to get in trouble for that. Perhaps they don't have a support network or they don't have folks who they can go to who can then point them in the direction of CASA. Maybe it's the relationship to the harm doer that keeps them from reporting because it, again, maybe is their parent, maybe it's their partner, maybe it is their teammate. The inability to identify their experience, and I think that is closely tied with a lack of sexual health knowledge, right? And not understanding what happens next. So just the fear of not knowing what getting help at CASA means, the fear of not knowing what happens if you tell your professor, the fear of the unknown in general, right? So tips for getting folks to CASA. This is where that survivor-centered piece comes in, is that they drive the ship. Survivor can tell me as much or as little as they wish. They don't need to tell me anything at all. They can just tell me how they think that I can help them. Again, I've said this a number of times, but we are absolutely confidential with no attachment to the university. And getting services through CASA could potentially be a great stepping stone introducing someone into therapy, which we can help them find a therapist or set up counseling with student services, any of those things, any of those referrals. All right, we are coming up on the final stretch here. So some options for students who come to CASA who are interested in reporting. You can report to law enforcement on campus or off campus. So you can report to campus PD if it happened on campus or on Water Street. If it happened outside of campus or outside of Water Street, you are looking at maybe Eau Claire Police Department, maybe Altoona Police Department. On a different wave, you can report to the university. So you can report to the Dean of Students or file a Title IX complaint, which would trigger an investigation. Medical care and the health and safety of all on our campus is really important, but a sexual assault or what is, nurse examiner is what SAAM is, commonly called rape kit, is something that also we are able to accompany someone to the hospital or point them in the right direction of receiving medical care. And of course, you cannot report at all, and that is totally fine. What we know is that there are a million valid reasons for not reporting. But what we can do is work on healing with the long-term care and coping skills. So really quickly, there's just this spectrum of prevention that feels really important to point out is that CASA we're a response. We will intervene when things have already happened. And that is when we kind of are at this light purple gray on the bottom, is that we're strengthening individual knowledge and skills. Of course, we're healing, but along that journey and in that path, we look at skills, we look at knowledge, we look at our understanding of consent, we look at how we feel about empowerment and autonomy. And then as we go up this ladder, we call on different folks to join us, right? We can't educate providers without providers being willing to learn. So thank you for being here today. But we can't influence policy and legislation, right? If we are in the office doing all of this work. So we're calling on other members of our community. We're calling on other members of our campus community to help us. And so really briefly, CASA's closest counterparts, of course, our mother agency is Family Support Center, but the Dean of Students Office, counseling services, student health and wellness. GSRC is the Gender and Sexuality Resource Center. We have a great relationship with them. We get lots of referrals from them. I recently was speaking with the folks at GSRC, and they said they really value CASA and the services we provide because they feel confident that they can send their students over here and know that their gender will be affirmed, which I think is a wonderful thing. Women and Gender Studies, the program, we work with capstone students annually to work on Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and just in general, are big proponents of our program and the activities and events that we hold. Bolton Refuge House is a local domestic violence crisis center and organization in Eau Claire. Student organizations, I can't say enough good things about seeing young people who are taking matters into their own hands to create safe spaces. I will be meeting and will continue to meet with student organizations as long as I am in this position, as they are one of our closest supporters and counterparts, and have maybe the best handle on intervention and bystander intervention on campus. And lastly, any allies and co-conspirators, which today is you. That is the content I had prepared for today. I will open up for questions or comments if there are any. And yeah, in general, thank you so much for joining.
I appreciate the time and information so much. I am still a fairly new board member, so I enjoy learning more about the organization. Help and support. And my video is really finicky, so I don't know what's going on. I think I have a bad USB cord. So two questions, totally unrelated. So I don't know if I should give them both or allow you to answer the first one and then ask the second one. Do you have a preference? Does it matter?
Whatever you feel.
Okay, so number one, how you talked about close allies, and I'm sure that you do a lot on campus, but how do you market these services? How do people find out about it? Is it all, grassroots, people talking to each other, or is there a coordinated effort on campus or off campus in student housing? Or?
Great question. Yeah, so there certainly is a coordinated effort. The last year and a half, it's been pretty wild. I will say that the typical activities were interrupted in the last year and a half. So that effort, I think, is even more important now than ever before in reaching out to these students. So every year, orientation is a really big piece of this. Making sure that CASA is involved in orientation activities, that students are seeing me out and about at, CASA tabling events, making sure that I'm signed up to be a part of orientation. But then additionally, each year, and I'm just beginning to look at this now for the first time as I've been in this role for about 2 months or so, is working with housing. and training RAs each year, maybe each semester, connecting with resident hall assistants, so that they are knowledgeable of our services. Social media, we are on the university website. It's a lot of outreach. It's a lot of outreach. Any way that we can weasel CASA into an event somewhere, anywhere we can set up a table, anywhere that students can begin to connect me to these issues, to these supports, that's something that I'm looking to do. So I'm still—
And then grow your minions so that they go forth and talk more about it, or if they have recognized a situation, they know where to turn people.
Yes, I did want to mention that, Grace, I know you've had some success too, reaching out to folks on campus that we might not immediately think about as potential like referral sources, but where students are maybe making disclosures of sexual violence and that could be potential bridges to CASA. And one example was Grace and I presented in a literature class that was looking at some memoir by, I think it was, oh my gosh,
Janelle Miller.
Yep. So, and yeah, Carmen Maria Machado, I believe, was also covered. And so they were going to be looking at these books as part of the class, and the instructor wanted to really ensure that the students felt like safe and supported through the reading process. And so we were able to come in and talk a little bit about, you know, how to take care of yourself while you're reading challenging material, but also then offer CASA for ongoing services, whether someone had their trauma activated by reading these books, or just, you know, had any other need, or knew someone who might need those services. So that's been an awesome resource for CASA.
Awesome, thank you. And then unrelated, but I work at WEAU now, I'm the sales manager there. So if there's anything we can do to help, you know, we have community first sponsorship. So, you know, I know that college kids aren't necessarily our strongest demo, but we do have a very powerful website, and we can reach a variety of people in a variety of different ways. So, you know, and I've talked to Jerry a little bit about that stuff too, but if we can help get the word out about things, that's definitely something that I'm interested in talking about. So then unrelated, before I started at WEAU, I worked for Marshfield Clinic Health System Foundation. And one of the things we were just starting to get going was some fundraising and some funds for SAAM, expansion of the SAAM program, because at the time we had one nurse in Eau Claire, and we wanted to get some grant funding and try to train more nurses so that there was a wider variety of options for that. Because I know HSHS has some, and Mayo does. But beyond that, I heard horror stories of sending women to Gunderson and La Crosse, which to me seems like, if I'm in a situation where I've just been violated in whatever way, and I'm traumatized and in this ugly situation, and hopefully I have an advocate with me, but the last thing I'm going to do is drive an hour and a half for this, and I'm more likely to just sweep it under the rug and probably move on without doing anything. And that just was disheartening to me. So very strong program in Marshfield, but we really didn't have a lot going on over here, which was embarrassing. And we were trying to get that going. And I think they still are. And the person that took over for me is very passionate about that. So can you explain, like, is that still the situation? Is SAAM still just an absolute disaster over here, and we don't nearly have the assets we need to meet the need?
I can kind of speak to that. I think that we do have two robust SAAM programs at HSHS and at Mayo. However, and I was part of those conversations with Marshfield Hospital as well. The ultimate goal would be to allow patients to have a choice. If they come to their home hospital, the place where they receive medical care following a sexual assault, and present for services there, we want to be able to ensure they can receive services there in a place where they feel maybe comfortable and supported. So we're definitely open to those ongoing conversations. And we have a sexual assault response team that I know historically Marshfield Hospital has been looped into those activities. But I also want to put out there that between the two hospitals that do have active SAAM programs in Eau Claire and the greater Chippewa Valley, they are able to provide 24-hour coverage. So what I would suggest is if someone has questions about how they access a SAAM exam, absolutely call CASA, call Family Support Center 24 hours a day, and we can be there to support that person and make sure that they don't face a situation where they're having to drive 90 miles to receive services or wait hours and hours, that we can be an advocate for them to get those timely services that are so important.
And two, if somebody is at their home hospital and a SAAM nurse is not available, SAAM exams are free to survivors. They should never receive a bill for it. So if that is the concern for going to their home hospital or one within their insurance provider, and they don't have a SAAM program, they can go to any other hospital that does without worry of the financial burden of what may come from a bill following an exam. And if additional medical services are needed following that, they can receive those at their primary hospital without needing to go back to the one that gave them the exam.
Awesome, good info. And I'd certainly pass on, like Sarah, I see put some info in the chat there to Britt, who is the former colleague of mine that took over at Marshfield Hospital for the foundation over here in the West. So I think that's still an ongoing thing, and trying to find community advocates to really get a fund going in order to support that. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, any other questions or comments? Excellent. Well, thanks so much for joining. Again, you can reach out with any questions to us at Family Support Center, and we'd be happy to answer those for you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye now.